Welcome everyone to lesson number 1 on medieval architecture. Medieval architecture in general begins with basilican style architecture. For our purposes, we're mostly going to be focusing on sacred architecture, architecture of churches, since that's where most of the ingenuity and energy and wealth of the builders of the Middle Ages took place. So the basilican style architecture, which flourished from the very end of the period of the Roman Empire for the next several centuries, the first centuries of Christian Europe, we could say, was named after a style of building that was common in Roman pagan culture. That is, a basilica, which is a kind of courthouse building. It wasn't a sacred building. It wasn't used for worship. So one of the reasons why it became the first main style of church architecture, of Christian architecture in Europe, was because it didn't have the associations with pagan worship. It was a secular or non-religious kind of building to begin with, and so is that it wasn't associated with the ancient Greek or Roman gods. Another reason why it was adopted by early Christians once they were allowed to worship in public, didn't have to hide in their private homes, was because it provided a great big space under a single roof to allow worshipers to worship together, and that was an important aspect of Christian worship. Unlike, say, pagan worship, the ancient Greek and Roman religions, where while they might have outdoor festivals to worship together or to perform sacrifices, much worship took place privately at individual altars or shrines. Christians wanted to worship together, to conduct Mass together, and the basilican style building provided a good opportunity for that. One of the distinguishing features is the clerestory, that upper story, which, because it wasn't supporting as much of a roof, wasn't supporting a roof that was covering the entire building, but only the middle section, the walls that held it up could be thinner and could be opened up with windows. So, as we'll see, that provided natural light, which was both practical but also symbolic. The natural light flowing in from above also would symbolize the light of God, the goodness and grace of God descending from heaven. So the key features of the basilican style plan are the nave, the central aisle, which is long and rectangular, side aisles, which provided access, and an apse, that semicircular projection at the end of the building where the altar would be placed, in front of which the altar would be placed, and which provided a kind of a special stage-like area. Typically, the basilican style church had a peaked roof made of timbers and then covered with either slate or tile. There you can see the apse at the end of this building, and there's the nave. The basilican style church gave way to, or sort of overlapped with, the development of the Byzantine style of architecture, which is named after Byzantium, the capital of the eastern half of the Roman Empire, which was eventually renamed Constantinople, and which the city itself is now the city of Istanbul in Turkey. So Constantinople, or Byzantium, became the major successor to the city of Rome after Rome was sacked. And Rome was no longer much of an inhabitable place. So Byzantium became the de facto center of Christian culture and a very wealthy center. And so it encouraged the building of these magnificent Byzantine-style churches, which spread all over the Eastern Christian world, from as far east as Russia to South Africa and westward into Italy. Its characteristics are, unlike the basilican style church, which is more rectangular, tended to have a circular or octagonal or square shaped floor plan with a central dome right over the top. And very often they were very elaborately decorated on the inside. Notice both the Byzantine and the basilican style church, these early Christian churches, are often really kind of plain and fortress-like on the outside, basically for defensive purposes. But on the inside, they could be really spectacular. That also adds to some of the symbolism of these churches. that the exterior, the sort of physical outside of the church, was nothing to brag of necessarily, although they could look pretty impressive on the outside. But the real glory of it was on the inside, sort of representing the idea in Christian belief that the real glory of an individual is in their interior soul. So you could say that the inside of the church represented the soul of it. The most impressive, what's by general consent considered the most impressive, magnificent of all the Byzantine churches, is a building known as the Hagia Sophia, which is Greek for holy wisdom. It's no longer a church today. It was built as a Byzantine cathedral in about the year 530, in the 530s, in Byzantium. It lasted as a cathedral, as a basilica rather, for about 1,000 years, and then in the 1400s it was converted into a mosque because by that point Istanbul had become an Islamic city. And then in modern times, in the 20th century, the Turkish government converted it into a museum. So it's no longer used for worship, it's just used for visitors. And it is a pretty impressive church. At the time, it was the largest building ever built and remained so for about 1,000 years. And its dome, which you can see right in the center there, is still considered one of the great engineering marvels. It was one of the largest domes ever built, comparable in size to the dome of the Pantheon. And there you can see it from the inside. You can see that row of windows along the bottom edge of it helps almost make it look like it's levitating, like it's floating off the top of the building. You can see there's a lot of elaborate decoration, mosaic on the inside. One thing you'll notice, this is true of almost all mosques, is that there are no representations of human beings, of living figures in the decoration inside the mosque. That's contrary, it's considered, it's prohibited by Islamic belief. And so when the Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque, all of the frescoes and mosaics that showed Christian images of living beings, of Christ and saints and so on, were either stripped off or basically chiseled off or whitewashed over, covered with plaster. In modern times, some of them have been rediscovered and replaced. But for the most part, you don't see pictures of people inside mosques. Another significant Byzantine-style church is this Church of San Vitale in Ravenna, in Italy. Ravenna is a city that's a couple of, like 100 miles or so east of Rome. And when Rome, in the last years of the Roman Empire, when the city itself was becoming really hard to inhabit because it was just falling into decay, basically the center of Western Christianity moved to this smaller city of Ravenna, which was easier to protect. And so that became a major center of Byzantine architecture in Italy. San Vitale is one of the most notable. It's not as significant a church as the Hagia Sophia. If you need to just know one, Hagia Sophia is the one to know. But one thing that's notable about San Vitale is, even more so than the Hagia Sophia, it's got some really impressive mosaics on the inside. So that's it for early Christian architecture, early medieval architecture. Come back for part 2